The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. Khushwant Singh was an Indian author, journalist, lawyer and a politician. As a writer, he was known for his humor, sarcasm and satirical mode of writing. Through the title of this chapter, Khushwant Singh draws the portrait, that is the picture of an old lady, verbally. That means through words. This lady was his grandmother, who was a very good friend and support to him. The entire story revolves around this old lady, and the portrait never changes as the behavior of the lady never changed since the narrator saw her. The story is narrated by an unnamed narrator in the first person narrative. While we read the chapter, we will see that the theme of innocence revolves in the entire story. Let's try to understand the chapter paragraph-wise. In paragraph 1, we see that it is difficult for the narrator to imagine his grandmother being young and pretty once, for he has always seen her as an old woman having lots of wrinkles. That means lines or folds. He could not accept it as being truth and therefore says that it is hard to believe. The narrator gives a beautiful description of his grandfather's portrait, that is the picture, which was hung in their drawing room above a mantelpiece. Mantelpiece means a structure of marble or stone above a fireplace. His grandfather looked 100 years old with his long white beard which covered his chest. He was wearing a big turban, pagri, that means a long piece of cloth around his head, and his clothes that he was wearing were also very loose. The narrator sees his grandfather so old that he considers him having lots and lots of grandchildren and not having any wife or children, because he thinks that only a young man can have a wife and children. Theme of innocence can be identified as the narrator always looked upon his grandmother with the eyes of an innocent child. He cannot imagine his grandmother being a different person that is young and pretty, because all he has known is she being old. And whenever his grandmother used to tell them of a young age when she used to play and make fun as a child, he could not imagine it as being truth. He thought it as absurd, that means illogical, and undignified, that means disrespectful on her part. The narrator even considered it unlike any other fables of saints, that means the short stories conveying morals told by his grandmother. In paragraph 2, the narrator describes his grandmother's appearance in details. She was short, fat and bent. It means that she was so old that she could not stand straight and her face was full of wrinkles. Here, the last line is important. The narrator could not accept anyhow that his grandmother was young because he firmly believed that she had always been the way he knew her since last 20 years. He considered her so badly old that she could not grow much older than that. The narrator considering her beautiful is very interesting because we can make out that his vision was beyond the level of only having physical beauty. In his eyes, she wasn't pretty by looks but was beautiful from heart. The narrator's grandmother used to move about in the house in an awkward way, putting one hand on her waist in order to balance herself. She was dressed in spotless white, that is absolutely clear white colored dress. Her white hairs were tied untidily and were scattered, that means disorganized in her pale face. She used to recite prayers constantly which was inaudible, that is, which cannot be heard. It suggests that she did not want to disturb anyone. The narrator using the color white also symbolically suggests she being pure. As in literature, white is often used to signify purity. Beads of rosary means a string of beads in order to keep count of prayers. मोतियों की माला जो पूजा में जाप करने के काम आते हैं. He compares his grandmother with the winter landscape, which refers to peace and contentment in her appearance and her way of living, which gave more charm to her character. In paragraph 3, the narrator describes the relationship with his grandmother. They had the strong bond of friendship. His parents left him in the village when he was very small and went to settle in the city. Since then, he used to live with his grandmother. She used to wake him up and get him ready for school every morning. She also used to help him in taking bath, and during that time her lips moved constantly in prayers, which was monotonous. That means dull and boring for the narrator. The narrator used to love her voice and respect her. And because of this, he says that he used to listen to her prayers but had no interest in learning it. The narrator mentions about slates. In old time, children did not used to write in copies but used slates. That means wooden board which has to be plastered, that means cleaned from time to time. They used chalks to write with. Grandmother every day handed him the slate, an earthen pot and a red pen. Before school, he used to eat steel chapatis. That means the chapatis were not fresh. It might be suggestive of the fact that grandmother used to make the chapatis the night before and keep it for the morning. As she was old, it was not possible for her maybe to cook food in the morning. She used to apply some sugar and butter on it and feed her grandson. We also learn that she even used to carry some chapatis for the village dogs. In paragraph 4, we see that grandmother used to accompany the narrator to school as it was attached to a temple. The narrator along with other children were taught alphabet and morning prayers by the priest. Priest means a person who performs religious ceremonies. हिंदी में हम पुरोहित या पुजारी भी कहते हैं जो धार्मिक अनुष्ठान करवाते हैं. As there was no concrete school building at that time unlike today, so the children used to sit in verandas in rows and study. All of them were very busy singing the alphabet and prayer in chorus, that means all together. And on the other hand, grandmother used to sit inside the temple and read religious books, that means the scriptures, which we call dharmik granth in Hindi. After school, they used to walk back home together. At the temple door, the village dogs used to gather for the chapatis, and while they kept on walking, the dogs used to follow them, barking and fighting with each other for the pieces of chapatis. In paragraph 5, we learn about the time when an important change took place in their life. The narrator describes it as the turning point in his and grandmother's friendship. When the narrator's parents were settled in the city, they called him and grandmother to stay with them together. Both of them, that is the narrator and grandmother, went to the city, but the things were totally different for them. Although the narrator used to share the same room with his grandmother, but there was a distance in between, as grandmother no more joined him on the way to school. He used to travel by a motor bus in an English school. There were no dogs in the street anymore, and grandmother now used to feed the sparrows in the courtyard. Now courtyard is an open space in the ground without any roof. मतलब कि छत की वो खुली जगह जो चारों ओर दीवारों अथवा इमारतों से घिरी होती है, जिसे आंगन भी कहा जाता है. In paragraph 6, we see that with the passage of time, this distance grew much wider as they hardly got time to spend with one another. Initially, she used to wake him up and get him ready for school, and after he returned, she used to inquire about what he learned that very day. The narrator would reply that the things taught in his English schools were words in English, things of Western science, the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the world being round, etc. Hearing this, grandmother was very upset because of two reasons. First, because she could not help her grandson with his studies. And secondly, because she did not like the things taught in the English schools and thus was in stress regarding the fact that the English schools did not teach anything about God, the Almighty, and the scriptures, that is, the religious books. There was more distance in their relationship when grandmother learned that the narrator was taught music in school, because to her, music was not meant for dignified individuals and gentlemen. She considered it to be associated with beggars and harlots, that means the prostitutes. She did not utter any word but was silent, and this silence suggested that she could not accept it and therefore talked to him very rarely, that means not often. Here in paragraph 7, we learn about the next phase in their life. The narrator opted for higher education and therefore went to the university where he was given a separate room to stay. And after that, their friendship was almost broken, that is, snapped. But grandmother did not utter any word and accepted her loneliness very calmly. She did not show any kind of emotions on her face and was quiet. Grandmother was all alone now. She stopped talking to anyone. And in order to keep herself busy, she took the help of the spinning wheel, that is the charkha. She sat by the spinning wheel working and at the same time reciting prayers from morning till evening. For a little while in the afternoon, she used to leave the spinning in order to feed the sparrows. The narrator's grandmother used to sit in the veranda and break the bread into little pieces to feed the sparrows. The little birds used to gather around her, thus making a chaos and noises by their chirpings. They create a bedlam, that means a scene or state of confusion during that period of time. Some sat on grandmother's legs, some on her shoulders and the others on her head. But she never shooed, that means pushed them away by waving her hands. Instead gave a sweet smile, and that was the happiest hour of the day for her. In paragraph 8, we see that after completing his university, the narrator decided to continue with his studies further in abroad. As he would be away for 5 long years, he knew his grandmother would be sad because she was at that stage of life in which one could never tell. That is, grandmother's last days were uncertain. They were not sure when she would breathe her last. She could die anytime. But grandmother, on the other hand, showed no sign of being emotional. Maybe because she did not want it to be an obstacle in her grandson's life. It also indicates grandmother's selfless love for her grandson. We can identify the theme of love, acceptance, selflessness, and respect for each other's decision through these lines. The narrator's grandmother went to the railway station to bid him goodbye, but she did not talk or express any kind of emotion. She was totally lost in prayers. Here, her constant prayer must be suggestive that she was praying for her grandson's good health and safe return from abroad. She was chanting with the beads of rosary in her hand. And when it was time for him to leave, grandmother kissed his forehead and the narrator tried to preserve the precious moment as he knew that he might not see her ever again, because she could breathe her last any time in these 5 years, and maybe this will be the last physical contact between them. But in paragraph 9, we learn that the narrator was wrong, because after 5 years when he came back, he saw his grandmother at the station, who was there to welcome him back home. To him, she looked the same and not even a day older when he left for abroad. This suggests of their inevitable love for each other, which was able to surpass the boundaries of time and space. Grandmother was still the same. There was not even a single change in her attitude towards him. She dedicated herself entirely in prayers and had no time for words. The narrator could hear her reciting prayers when she held him tightly in her arms. After they returned back home, grandmother was busy feeding the sparrows, and the narrator says that it was still the most happiest moment for her. She used to scold the sparrows in a loving and carefree way when they made noises or sat on her shoulders. The narrator terms it as frivolous rebukes, that means tuch vidro. Through these lines in paragraph 10, we encounter a change in grandmother's attitude. She, for the first time, stopped praying and invited the neighborhood women to their house. She took an old drum and started to sing the homecoming of warriors, that is, the coming back of her grandson. This continued for several hours. She thumped, that is, hit the old drum with her fist, that means closed hand. मतलब कि वो मुट्ठी से उस ड्रम को ठोक रही थी. The drum was not at good condition and was almost worn out, maybe because it was kept unused for several years. We can associate the drum with grandmother's present state. Both were old and not in good condition to survive for long. The narrator, along with others, had to advise her to stop in order to avoid overstraining. मतलब कि नैरेटर ने बहुत समझा बुझाकर अपनी अम्मा को रुकने के लिए राजी किया ताकि उन पर कोई दबाव न पड़े और अत्यधिक बल लगाने की वजह से उनकी सेहत न बिगड़ जाए. And the narrator says that this was for the first time in his entire life when he saw his grandmother without praying. Paragraph 11 describes the next morning when grandmother was ill. She had a slight fever which was not very strong, and the doctor told them that she will get well soon. But grandmother knew that she would die very soon and thus informed them about the same. Grandmother told them that she omitted, that means she stopped praying because it was time for her to close her eyes forever, thus closing the last chapter of her life. Grandmother added that she did not want to waste time talking to them anymore. Paragraph 12 describes the end of grandmother. In this paragraph, we learn about the most pathetic and painful phase in the life of their family, especially for the narrator. When grandmother informed them of her last hours, they protested. That means they did not approve or agree to her in this regard. उन सभी को यह अमान्य था और वे इसका विद्रोह करने लगे. But grandmother ignored everything. She peacefully laid on her bed, praying and chanting the name of God on a rosary. But sadly, before they could believe, her lips stopped praying. The rosary fell down, and she was lifeless. They saw peace on her face at that time and knew that she was no more. In paragraph 13, we see that following the traditions and customs, they lifted grandmother off the bed and laid the dead body on the ground, thus covering it with a long loose piece of cloth, that is a red shroud or shawl. They mourned and expressed grief for several hours, and after that started preparations to bury the dead body. Stretcher refers to an apparatus used for moving patients and dead bodies. They went to her room in the evening with a stretcher to dispose the dead body by burning it to ashes. It was the time of sunset, which refers to an end of a day. Symbolically, it suggests the end of this beautiful lady from earth. The setting sun lighted up her room and veranda where she used to spend the happiest moments of her days after coming to the city with a ray of golden light. They stopped after walking halfway in the courtyard. Thousands of little sparrows were gathered in grandmother's room, in the veranda, and in the place where her dead body was kept. They too mourned her death. The birds, though could not speak and express their pain, kept quiet. They did not chirp. Everyone was very upset looking at them and their condition. The narrator's mother brought some bread for them and broke it into little pieces, just the way his grandmother used to do, and threw it to the birds. But the sparrows did not care to have it and left it untouched. They flew away from the place very quietly after grandmother's dead body was carried off. This reflects their love for grandmother. Not even a single bird ate any piece of bread, and the next morning a sweeper cleaned the place by sweeping away the breadcrumbs into the dustbin. We see that the theme of acceptance is portrayed and explored in the entire story. With the elapse of time, grandmother was left all alone, but she accepted it and never complained. The end is interesting, as the narrator is quick to accept his grandmother's death. She too accepted her end peacefully by being fully conscious about it. The narrator is left with memories of happiness, remembering the times he spent with his grandmother, and also because somewhere he knew that she was having a good life. She spent a good life even if he cannot fully imagine. This story also shows how love and emotion is experienced not only by humans but animals and birds too. With this, we come to an end of this chapter. Hope you understood my explanation. Thank you.